Here we go. Gentlemen, welcome to Cracking the Case, Mystery Writing 101. My name is Pony Josiah 13. I am the author of Ponyville Noir, an ongoing...
Can you turn the music down?
Yeah.
Stop button. Sorry.
As I was saying, my name is Pony Josiah 13. I've been in the fandom for 10 years, and in that time I've written a lot of mystery and crime fiction. In particular, the critically acclaimed Ponyville Noir series on film fiction. So, I'm here today to give you a few pointers on how to write a mystery story. Let's get started. Step 1. The setup. This is everything you'll need to know before you even start writing. You should have all of the familiar 7 questions answered before you even get started. What, who, where, when, why, and how. What seems simple enough. You might think, just what is the crime? But no. What is actually the driving mystery of the story? What propels the story forward? It could be as simple as who murdered the actress, or it might be something more simple, something a bit more complex. What does the code say? Where did the treasure go? Is that suspect actually innocent? And consider, once you get your what answered, you'll figure out what the driving conflict of the story is. Who? You want to know who your victim is, who your perpetrator is, who your other suspects are, and who your detective is. Consider who your victim is, what they would do, what they did that would then unfortunately cause them to be the victim of this crime. In our example, let's have an example of a young and upcoming actress who was found strangled in her dressing room. Who is your perpetrator and your suspects? Once you figure out your victim, figure out everyone who might be connected to them and who might profit from the crime. In our actress example, we might say she has a rival who's jealous of her for upstaging her. She's got her husband that she's cheating on. She's got an ex-lover that she jilted. She's got a director who couldn't stand her tantrums anymore, etc., etc. You can start out already knowing who your perpetrator is, or you might just gather a list of suspects and then decide later on. Either one works. Lastly, you'll need to decide who your detective is, how they get involved in the story, and what skills and perspective they bring. Are they a police detective who's just investigating crimes part of their job? Are they a friend of the victim who's trying to get justice? A reporter who's trying to get the scoop, just a passerby? I like Jessica Fletcher from Murder, She Wrote. You get consider their backgrounds, their skills, and their perspective. So that's you know how they'll act in the scenes and how they'll go forward with the investigation. Where and when? Where and when does the crime take place? Simple enough. You want to know where it actually happens because that affects how it went down, and you'll also want to know where your other suspects were at the time of the crime. In a broader sense, where and when also refers to the setting in general, level of technology, and how societal cultures view things. Like, if you're writing your story in Victorian London, your detective obviously isn't going to send blood samples to the lab for a DNA comparison. And this also determines societal standards and how things might reflect on them. Like, if you're writing your story set in the 1950s and it turns out, your victim was a African-American individual, that might affect people's perspectives on the crime and how the motive behind it. And speaking of motive, why? What is the motive for the crime? What did your perpetrator hope to gain from it? In our example, we'll say the ex-lover strangled her in a fit of passion because she turned him down. It's easy enough. And why also determines whether the crime was premeditated, whether they planned it out ahead of time, or spur of the moment, and which affects how much planning went into it. Get into the head of your perpetrator and decide what they were thinking in the lead up to the crime and how they would act before, during, and after the crime. So the last question we need to answer is how, and that's big enough to get an entire section of itself, where we get into part 2, the crime. The modus operandi, or mode of operation. How was the crime committed? Gentlemen, if you take away nothing else from this presentation, I want you to take away this. Mystery stories are not something you can make up as you go along. You have to have the crime planned out ahead of time because everything depends on how it went down. When you're planning out your crime, I want you to keep in mind this principle. Locard's exchange principle, named for Edmund Locard, considered by many to be the father of modern forensic scientists. Every contact leaves a trace and takes a trace with it. This can be pretty obvious. Let's say your suspect stepped in a puddle of wet paint. They'll leave behind footprints and left paint on their shoe. And it can be more subtle things. Broken glass on their sleeve from the window they climbed into. Blood droplets on the ground from the cuts they got in the fight of the victim and the scar on their cheek. Hair that they left behind. And when you're planning out your crime, consider everything that they touched, everything they took with them, everything they left behind, everything they damaged. Those are all the clues that are going to lead how the investigation goes down. So how it gets split down into 3 sections: before, during, and after the crime. Before the crime, you'll want to consider how much planning your perpetrator went put into the crime. Did they get any equipment? Did they do surveillance of the area beforehand, or maybe they already knew the layout? Now, what experience did they bring? Like, say your perpetrator was a young burglar, was out for his first crimes. You might just pick a house at random. He'll come in at like 2 p.m., just bring a crowbar, he'll smash the window, get in, grab some stuff, and get out. He's young and inexperienced. He doesn't really know what he's doing. More experienced burglar will take the time to know the layouts, to determine when the homeowners are gone. They might take less equipment. They might just jimmy the door instead of breaking it open. They might wear a jacket that makes them look like a delivery person or something as a disguise. In our example, talk about the ex-lover. He worked at the theater, so he knows the layouts. So he wanted to try to win the actress back. So he buys a bouquet of roses and just hangs out near the back entrance until someone comes out and sneaks in behind them. During the crime, everything that goes in from the entrance to when they actually achieve their goal. How does your perpetrator get into the house? How do they find what they're looking for? What obstacles do they encounter on the way, like security cameras, guards, or witnesses? How do they get around them? What unexpected obstacles come up and how do they deal with this? Like if they're infiltrating a party and someone wants to talk to them, how do they deal with that? Once they actually get to their goal, how do they go about achieving it? Going back to our lover and the actress, he knows the area, so he heads down the back halls to her dressing room and waits there for her to come back. When she arrives, he tries to win her back. He laughs at him. He gets mad, smashes a carafe over her head in strength, and goes in a fit of passion. Simple enough. That gives you an idea of how it went down. Finally, part 3, after the crime. What did your perpetrator do after they achieved their objective? Did they try to clean up anything? Did they leave behind a signature or a calling card, like writing red rum on the window or something? How did they get out, and who might have seen them leaving? Did they try to dispose of any evidence, or maybe try to frame someone else for the crime? And in the example of the ex-lover, once he realizes that the actress is dead, he panics. He cleans himself off. He gathers up the bouquet of roses he left behind. He leaves behind a message on the dressing room window, like this is what you get to try to throw detectives down the false trail. He walks out, dripping blood from a cut on his hand you didn't even notice, tosses the bouquet in a dumpster, and gets a taxi home. Okay. Now you have your crime planned out, so now you'll have a rough idea of what evidence they left behind. And this is where we get in the meat of the story. Part 3, the investigation, as in the part you actually get to write. Bearing in mind, in most mystery stories, the crime takes place off-screen. The reader doesn't see it happen. So everything that happens needs to be described through the investigation. The real start of the story is the scene of the crime. Everything that's been left behind, everything that your culprit has left behind, is where your detective is going to start their investigation. Also bear in mind, there's probably some time that passed between when the crime is actually committed and when your detective gets on the scene. You'll have to account for other people getting in there. Like someone came in and discovered the body, police came in, firefighters, and EMTs, and they'll all have left behind traces that you'll have to account for. This is getting complicated, isn't it, folks? So, once they get to the crime scene, paint a picture for us. What does your detective see? What do they hear? What do they smell? What do they feel? What do they taste? And what does that tell them? In our actress scene, your detective comes into the scene. Your actress is lying there dead. She's got strangle marks in her neck. There's the broken paraffin on the ground. Message on and lipstick on the mirror. Blood drops leading down the hallway. Bouquet of roses in the dumpster. So those are all the clues that you'll have to go through. And that, building off of that, is deductions. And when your detective finds a piece of evidence, you should think, what does this tell them and what do they do next? If you take a science class, you might know about the scientific theory. From observation to hypothesis to experiments to conclusion to new hypothesis. For example, your detective finds some muddy footprints and outside the window and finds a size 12, so he thinks, aha, there's some size 12 boots outside here. They might belong to the hypothesis, they might belong to the burglar. I should see if there's anyone around the house who wears size 12 boots and compare the tread marks. So he questions the gardener. He finds his boot prints match, so he thinks, aha, the gardener left behind these boot prints. Hypothesis, maybe he's the burglar. You might also want to consider the lack of evidence. Have any of you read Agatha Christie? All right. Have you read her book, Crooked House? All right. Non-spoiler, the victim in that case was killed because someone replaced his bottle of eye drops with a bottle of poison. At first, everyone was willing to write it off as an accident, but then the police find the bottle of eye drops in the trash can with the fingerprints wiped off, and that gets them suspicious because if it was an accident, then how'd those eye drops get in there and why are the fingerprints wiped off? So sometimes the lack of evidence can also tell a story. Another example. If your detective is investigating a murder where the victim was shot and they're in a room with no blood in it, your detective might think, where's the blood? Did the culprit clean it up, or maybe the shooting took place somewhere else? What you want to avoid doing, though, is going too far with your deductions. You want to make sure that your deductions make sense, or you'll hit a bad deduction named for a certain so-called world's greatest detective. Bad deductions, as they are called in the TV Tropes website, if you're familiar with it, are what happens when your detective just knows the correct answer, even though they logically shouldn't. Like, for example, your detective finds ashes from a certain brand of cigarette at the crime scene, and he knows the victim's brother smoked so he thinks, aha, the victim's brother was having an affair with his wife, the victim's wife, and they conspired to make the murder look like a suicide. Wrong. That makes your detective look bad, and it's a lazy way to advance the story. All that ad should tell them, there was someone that was smoking that brand of cigarette here, I should find out who it was. So deductions are basically the stepping stones of your story. Your detective finds evidence, they make a hypothesis, they test the hypothesis, and they continue going on until they reach a conclusion. At some point, your detective is probably going to want to talk to the suspects and the witnesses. And this is where we get into interviews and interrogations. There's a difference between the two. An interview is non-confrontational. It's only to get information. Tell me what happened. An interrogation is confrontational with a goal to get a confession. I know you did it. I want to know. I want you to tell me. When your detective is doing an interview with someone, you want to get into both of the detective's head and consider what they already know, and your witness or your suspect's head and consider what they know, what they saw, and what they have a reason to tell the truth and to lie about. Question.
Doesn't sometimes the interviews become the interrogations? Well, some suspects found withholding information.
That's correct. An interview can become an interrogation if your detective finds something else, or they might start as an interview. It might start as an interview, but your detective already knows that they're the culprits, and then it turns into an interrogation. That's a very good question. I'll touch on that later. When your detective is interviewing your suspects, They should be measuring everything their suspect says against what they know, and also reading their body language. What and read what your suspect is doing. Watch their eye shifts. Watch them fold their arms and shuffle in place. Watch them lick their lips. Yes. If your detective is good at reading body language, they should be able to tell or at least suspect when their suspect is lying or at least hiding information from them, and that can be another clue. Um, Now, as for interrogation, as I said, that's confrontational, and you're trying to get at a confession of the suspect. One biggest key to an interrogation is to pretend to know more than you actually do. Your detective should go into an interrogation pretending that they already know everything that happens, and they just want to hear the suspect's story. You should also match their interrogation style to the suspect. It's not just the good cop, the bad cop routine. And there's different ways to get at a confession out of someone and how to get in under their skin. Like, if your detective is interviewing their ex-lover, they might try the sympathy angle. Hey man, I understand. You loved her. She just thought you were tooling through you aside and broke your heart. You tried to win her back. She just laughed at you and you snapped. I understand. I mean, I'd probably do the same thing in your boots. That might be able to get under their skin, and because they think the detective understands. Again, you want to get into both your detective's head, consider what they know and read the suspects, and get into your suspect's head and consider what's going to get me to crack. In his book Mindhunter, FBI agent John Douglas, who helped create criminal profiling, talks about one case he came in where a young girl had her head bashed in with a rock. When he examined the scene, he determines a killer probably doesn't feel good about this. So here's what you do. When you find your culprits, take the rock that was used to bash your head in and place it on the table. If he's your killer, he won't be able to stop looking at it. So when the police find a guy, they put the rock on the table. Sure enough, the culprit can't stop looking at it and eventually confesses. From that, Agent Douglas had a saying, everybody has a rock. Everybody has a pressure point. Your suspect is going to have something that's going to get under their skin and get them to crack. Your detective should be trying to find what that is. Okay, we're getting to the end here, and I'm going to wrap it up with some do's and don'ts. Do your research. Research pathology, research forensics, research psychology, research your time period and the technology available to them. Since everything in a mystery story is about presenting evidence realistically and logically, you should also present your story realistically and logically. Do have the culprit react to the investigation. Your perpetrator is not some static object that's just going to sit there and wait for the police to catch up to them. They're going to react to the oncoming investigation. If they know the police are onto them, they might try to run away or eliminate some evidence or a witness, or they might try to come up with a new alibi. Or your other suspects, too. You'll have to consider what kind of clues that will leave behind, too. Do write what you know. If you know a lot about the 1930s, you can set a story set in the Great Depression. If you know a lot about psychology, you can create a psychological thriller. If you know a lot about space travel, make a mystery story that's set on the moon in 2055. Write what's familiar to you, and everything else will fall into place. Do allow your detective to be wrong once in a while. It makes them look human, and it can be a way to reveal more information. Going back to our actress angle, let's say your detective thinks that the husband did it, and so he starts pressuring them about it. And so he says, I know you killed your wife. And the husband says, look, it wasn't me. Hey, why not? And I was with this other girl I'm sleeping with at the time. Why don't you talk to the guy who's been sending her all those creepy photos and letters? So your detective goes, whoa. Someone's been sending her photos and letters, and that might be how the culprit is revealed. On a similar note, do reveal more information gradually. Remember that this is a story. It has a plot. Excuse me. It has your plots. It has your introduction. It has conflict. It has rising tension, a climax, and a release of tension. And this isn't a police report. Reveal more information gradually over time to keep your reader's interest. Do not make the butler the culprit. That trope is dead. Leave it in the grave. Do not make the detective the culprit. I have seen maybe one or two stories where this actually worked and made sense and didn't raise more questions than it did. And frankly, a lot of readers consider it cheating. Do not have your detective rely on hunches where they just know the correct answer. It's lazy, it makes your detective look too good, and again, it's cheating. Do not focus too much attention on a red herring or focus too little attention on the culprit. The readers are not stupid. If they're savvy about mystery stories, they'll know when you're trying to trick them. I mean, we all see it in the TV stories. Some extra gets introduced for like 2 minutes and then turns out, surprise, they're the culprits. Yeah, they're going to see that coming a mile away. I read one thriller novel last year where the writer was desperately trying to convince me that the main character's fiance was the killer, and spend like 85% of the story focusing on him. I figured out who the real killer was less than a third of the way into the book and was rolling my eyes the entire time. Last note, do not add too many twist revelations. Anyone seen the movie High Crimes with Morgan Freeman? No, you're doing yourself a service. That story kept adding so many twist revelations. No, he didn't do it. Oh, wait, he did do it. Oh, wait, he was part of the special operations group. Oh, wait, there's this guy out for revenge, and yada, yada, yada. Twist revelations, one or two of them are good. They keep the reader's interest and keep the story going. But too many, your readers are going to get bored and start yelling at you to get on with it already. Don't tire them out. Just keep the story going. On last notes, I want to talk about some recommended reading. I firmly believe that the best thing that any writer can do is read, and read a lot. So these are some books that have really helped me a lot during my time. Of course, I can't recommend the Sherlock Holmes series enough, and pretty much anything by Agatha Christie is good, although I strongly recommend And Then There Were None and Crooked House. Those are both really good. The Science of Murder by Carla Valentine is about the history of forensics in Agatha Christie's time and how they showed up in her stories. The Science of Sherlock Holmes by E.J. Wagner, that's about forensics in Arthur Conan Doyle's time and how they showed up in the Sherlock Holmes stories. Death's Acre by Dr. Bill Bass and John Jefferson. It's about the infamous body farm that you may have heard of, and it talks about forensic pathology. And Mindhunter by John Douglas and Mark Olshaker, which is about criminal psychology and profiling. There's actually one other story that I didn't put on here that I want to give an honorable mention to. It's called The Dante Club. I can't remember who it's written by, but it's a historical fiction novel set in late 19th century Boston that regards some scholars that are trying to translate Dante's Divine Comedy, and there's also some murders that are based on the Infernal story. It's an excellent thriller story. It's really well presented, and it's a good example of historical fiction and how you can tie ordinary people into a mystery, because the protagonists are just these ordinary scholars and professors as they're trying to solve the mystery. And that will bring us to the end of our conclusions. Any questions or comments? Yes.
Just out of curiosity, have you ever seen the movie Murder by Death?
I have not, I'm afraid. Have I ever seen the movie Murder by Death?
Sounds like the title of a Shadow Radio episode.
Well, I highly recommend it. It's kind of a version of all the show that people really enjoy.
So noted. I've also heard good things about Glass Onion.
Yes.
Yes.
So, do you have any suggestions for larger, overarching stories that contain multiple mysteries? Like, for example, stories about crime investigators, but there is an overarching arc with several mysteries in it.
Yes. Do I have suggestions for a story with multiple mysteries and overarching arc? Yes, I do. Excuse me. I actually wrote one of those. My story, Ponyville Noir Tales. That's Tales AI with two private eyes. Involves multiple different cases with an overarching story.
Big fan of it.
I believe you read that.
Yes.
Excellent. It's good to meet a fan. So, my suggestion is you want to plan, and when you're planning your crimes, you also want to consider the background. So the background of Ponyville Noir basically involved a gang war between the current gang and an up-and-coming gang. What I did was have the two gangs fighting in the background, and the detectives are basically trailing behind kind of cleaning up their messes, so to speak. Like, the first case involves a series of murders that were related to the theft of a necklace from an art museum. Consider how your detective gets involved in the case, and also what the overarching gang, what the motive for the overarching plot is. Like, why are the gangs fighting over this necklace? What do they gain from it? And you'll also want to and as your detectives proceed through the cases, consider how the gangs are going to react to what they do. If they arrest a significant leader on one side, the other side's going to gain an advantage, and they might press it, and that's going to that's going to create more crime to your detective to investigate, and then they might slip up, and your detectives are going to look at the other gang and realize that there's something going on there. To boil it down, excuse me, when you're doing an overarching theme, the overarching theme comes first, and then everything else should kind of fall into place if you divvy it up by chapters. Yes.
When you're trying to tackle on the setting, like the setting in Ponyville.
Yep.
How do you go about with it, considering that Equestria is more different than ours?
That's how do I go about creating a setting considering Equestria is different than ours? Well, that's a question for another panel entirely regarding alternate universes. But what I did was, I think the setting sometimes has to follow after the stories, and not entirely the other way around. When I was writing Ponyville Noir, I took a lot of inspiration from classic noir tropes. It's particularly the video game LA Noir. Several characters in the story are actually kind of ponified versions of characters in that game. So what I did was I kind of erased everything except the basics, and then I built the story from the ground up. We got this 1950s-esque, gritty, shadowy, neo-noir city with dirty cops and gangsters and politicians on the take. And that everything else kind of fits into place there.
One angry detective.
Yes.
So, would it be safe to assume that you've read some works by Raymond Chandler?
Have I read... I'm sorry?
Raymond Chandler?
I've read a few stories by Raymond Chandler, and my character, Philip Flander, is a nod to him, but yeah, I have read some Raymond Chandler. I'm afraid his style didn't really click with me, but that's no offense to him. Raymond Chandler was a great writer.
What are some takeaways that you can take from older stories like that, as far as like presentation, not necessarily how everything fits together in the mystery, how you go.
How takeaways from Raymond Chandler regarding presentation? Well, I mean, there's different types of takes. Raymond Chandler is one of the pioneers of the classic hard-boiled private eye genre, where your detective is just this gritty, cynical individual, living alone, spend most of his time drinking, and gets into the nitty-gritty of the stuff. You've also got Agatha Christie, which is usually presented as a point of view stories from the investigators, or the Sherlock Holmes stories where Watson is the narrator and he's narrating everything that goes on, or, any other mystery stories. The presentation should match your protagonist, I think. The story, excuse me. The Sherlock Holmes stories were presented from Watson, who's a bit of a wide-eyed, naive idealist, so we can get his takes on how awesome Sherlock is, and his views on on the horror of the crimes. Watson, in some ways, adds a very human element to the stories that would be lacking if Sherlock, the cold, clinical, calculating machine, tried to narrate them. And which is a great thing because, I'm sure if Sherlock wrote the stories, he would boil it all down to basically a report. It'd be dry and boring. Watson adds the human elements, which makes everything better. For Raymond Chandler and the Philip Marlowe stories, Philip Marlowe is a very cynical individual who is just trying to do his job in a city that's often dirty and miserable, and he views the setting through his own lenses. He's a guy who's just trying to do the right thing in a city where the right thing doesn't always come out in the best way. And in regards to going through the setting, that set him up as a sympathetic character in a setting where it might be hard to care about the characters. I think the point that I'm trying to reach here is make the perspective of the story match your protagonist. If your protagonist is a reporter out for the truth, they're going to be a bit of an idealist. They're going to try to get to the truth because the truth is worth knowing. If your protagonist is a cynical detective, they're going to be world weary. They're going to see, kind of seen this before. And this story might be about rediscovering their compassion and empathy. Does that help any?
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions? Yes.
So obviously, Philip and Daring, so I have a bit of an answer to this already, but what are your views on romance in mysteries, specifically between the detective and someone else?
That's a toughie. The question was, what's my view on romance between the detective and someone else? You have to be careful with that because it might compromise the detective's ability to solve the mystery if they get involved with an individual who has something to hide. Or they might be or it might be a deliberate ploy in their parts to get more information. That's a tricky question and a good question, but it kind of worked for me because Philip and Daring were co-partners and they trusted each other with their lives, so it's easier for me. But one thing you should definitely avoid is what TV tropes call the romantic plot tumor, where the romance kind of takes over the story and distracts from the main plots. Like, your reader wants to read a mystery story. They don't want to read a sappy romance between his world-weary, cynical private eye and the young blondes who helps him get a new lease on life. The romance should tie into the story and tie into the conflict. Part of Ponyville Noir involved Phil and Daring having a bit of a falling out after Daring's past came back to haunt her, and it tested their trust. But at the end of that case, they both came out stronger for it. So the basic point is make sure your romance ties into the story and doesn't distract from it. And also make sure that your romance makes sense and isn't just there so your detective can ask someone to squeeze.
If I may, Josie.
Yes.
To give you an example, look, I'm his editor. At one point, sort of a side plot that he examined and discarded was Daring having a pregnancy and giving up the fold because they felt they couldn't. Phil and Daring felt they couldn't, with their line work properly take care of it. That would have been an example of the romance starting to overtake it. It would have just been too much.
Thank you, Igor. Yes.
I have something to add to that too. The fact that we have the internet is kind of cool because we can get feedback. Because I feel like going kind of back into Raymond Chandler a bit, there was a character that he sort of got involved with in book 2. She doesn't appear ever again. She was a really interesting character. If the internet had existed back then, there probably would have been a lot of people saying, "Hey, are we going to see this person again?" Pay attention to things like that. If something's working, if the audience is really connecting with the character, maybe bring him back.
Yes.
An example of that I think worked out well is, ever read the Dresden Files?
The Dresden Files.
Familiar.
That's another series that I cannot recommend enough. It's both a mystery story and a urban magical series that has influenced me a lot.
But there was a reporter that the character Dresden got involved with named Susan Rodriguez. She pops in and out due to various circumstances, but her disappearances are always explained, and she keeps returning.
Well, she doesn't, but
Yes.
Anyone else? All right.
I have a question.
Yes, Eagle.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're working on now?
I was hoping to avoid that. Eagle wants to know about what I'm working on now. And the answer to that is you'll have to kind of wait and see. But
I'm mostly driving at there is something coming.
there is something coming, and it does involve those two lovely characters up on the screen there. But I don't want to give too much away at this time because, frankly, there's still quite a bit up in the air, and I need to settle on a few things.
It is.
All right, that will. All right, if there's no further questions, that will conclude the presentation. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you learned something.
If you gentlemen wouldn't mind, actually, would y'all mind gathering for a picture with the panelists?
Sure, love to.
My friend's never done